What's up, TMF Daily enthusiasts? Welcome to the TMF Daily Podcast. Today, I'm breaking down, keeping it really simple. What is the trial master file? Who's this bow tie girl that's talking about the TMF? I'm going to break it down as if you don't know what the TMF is. Because I have some followers that support me, but they really don't know what the TMF is. So that means I need to do a better job of explaining it. Let's start now. Get your pen, get your paper, and we are diving deep today. Roll up the sleeves and let's do this. So the trial master file, it's this comprehensive collection of essential documents, and it serves as the definitive record of a clinical trial's conduct, the integrity, and regulatory compliance. So the TMF is more than just documentation. It's more than just a file. The documentation, the files, it's a whole collection of them. And what the goal of the TMF is you want to be able to look at all the documentation of your paperwork or your electronic, which we'll get to. It could be paper or electronic. And it's going to capture the whole story of a clinical trial, as if you're reading a book from the intro to chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4. Think of the zones from the reference model. Those are your chapters. And depending on the type of study, some of those may not be applicable. But that's more higher level. We're not going to focus on that today. The TMF, it's regulated by multiple international standards. Like the TMF provides a transparent, it's audible trail of the entire research process. So let's talk a little bit about these regulatory authorities, right? So we have the FDA, Food Drug Administration, and it's 21 CFR parts 11 and 312. We've got the ICH, Good Clinical Practice Guidelines. And then we have the European Medicines Agency guidelines, as well as the Code of Federal Regulations. So let's talk about the acceptable forms of a TMF. Everything, all the documentations is just paper, and it's usually in a binder. Or you could have a more modern TMF called an eTMF, an electronic trial master file. And then you could have a hybrid. So some of your documents are paper and some of them are electronic. So you have a hybrid TMF when you have paper and electronic. So let's talk about sort of the consequences of not being in compliance with your TMF, right? So you have this regulatory noncompliance. There could be a study suspension. The data can be compromised. There could be even legal challenges. And let's talk about funding. The funding could be withdrew if your documentation isn't in place. Now let's chat a little bit about best practices for managing your TMF. So things that you want to consider is really implementing a standardized naming convention. Making sure that it's consistent, whatever's agreed upon, and that it's consistent throughout your study. You're using the same naming conventions. You want to establish clear document ownership, like who owns this document. You might want to think about quality control processes, regular internal audits, training the research teams on documentations and standards. And this type of training isn't a one and done, okay? It needs to be ongoing, continual. Using eTMF technology to your advantage. Getting the metadata from the documents. Tracking those KPIs, your key performance indicators, knowing your metrics, because if you don't know, then you don't know. Okay? You want to know where you're at. You want to know where you're going. You want to know where those gaps are. So when you think of the TMF, here's what I want you to think about. Think about tracking your every move. I know it sounds scary, right? Big Brother's watching. You want an audit trail. You want everything tracked, everything linked correctly. You want to keep up with the regulatory standards. So let's talk about what your TMF might include, right? Any kind of investor agreements, the protocol, consent forms, IRB approvals, adverse event tracking, data validation records, the investigators' qualifications, things like that. Your TMF, it's really how you prove your study's credibility to regulators, sponsors, and investigators. And ultimately, your TMF is telling a story. And so make it compelling, clear, and convincing. Lastly, remember, in clinical research, your TMF is your personal brand. With that audit trail, it's linking back to everybody who's worked in the TMF. That's your brand. That's your credibility. Make it stand out. Now let's break down your sponsor TMF and your site TMF, because both of these things make up the TMF. So the sponsor TMF, this is maintained by the study sponsor, okay? But they can outsource it through a CRO, a clinical research organization. And this has like a full comprehensive view of your clinical trial. And so things like this would include your protocol, your investigator agreements, like regulatory approvals, its overall study level documentation, your central trial management documentation. Now, on the other hand, your investigator site file, this is maintained by the individual research site. So it's site-specific documentation. And this will include like your local IRB approvals, your signed investigator agreements, your site-specific consent forms, patient recruitment records, any local regulatory communications, your site-specific adverse event tracking. So let's spot some key differences between your sponsor TMF and your site TMF. So your sponsor TMF, think global. Your investigator site file, think local. Now, the ownership. Your sponsor manages the TMF. Your site manages the investigator site file, the ISF. Sponsor TMF is broader to where the ISF is more granular. And what's the purpose, right? The sponsor TMF is for like the overall study oversight. Your ISF is for site-specific regulatory compliance. So both of these files, they are critical for regulatory compliance, and they must be maintained throughout the whole clinical trial. So who works in the TMF anyways? Well, your principal investigator could. Your clinical research coordinator definitely does. Regulatory affairs specialist, your clinical trial assistants, eTMF specialists, quality assurance managers, data managers, your study sponsor representatives, CRAs, IRB coordinators. Almost everybody touches the TMF in one way or another. Even biostatisticians, they do too. Everybody plays a part in it. So when we're thinking about some of the roles in managing a TMF, you want to be thinking about like document creation, document collection, version control, compliance tracking, audit preparation, electronic or physical file maintenance. If you think about it, having a successful TMF, that really requires collaboration amongst multiple research teams in the different roles. It really takes a village to have an awesome TMF.